And
I
here.
don't need this either.
Great. All right. I just wanted to say hello, everyone. Welcome to our Spotlight Speaker Series. We are so thrilled to have Angelo Corson, President and CEO. Oh, all right. Are we done with the music? Okay, great. I'll start that again. Hi, everyone. My name is Kitty Douglas. I want to welcome everyone to Big Tent USA, to our Spotlight Speaker Series. We are so thrilled to have Angelo Corson with us. He's the President and CEO of Media Matters. Before I introduce Angelo and Media Matters, I wanted to make sure you know what Big Tent is and highlight a couple of our upcoming events. Big Tent USA is a national grassroots advocacy organization that promotes moderate political platform focusing on the rights of all Americans, civic engagement, and good governance at both the state and federal level. Founded by a group of women in 2019, Big Tent breaks through the political noise, provides substantive information, concrete action items, and innovative activism opportunities. We are an inclusive group of women promoting American values of decency and effective governance, truthful and ethical leadership, equality, justice, and opportunity for all. On Tuesday, March 23rd at noon, we will be hosting a staffer from Senator Blumenthal's office to help us unpack the filibuster, something I still don't understand and really need to. On Wednesday, March 31st, Congressman Sarbanes of Maryland and Doug Gansler, who is the former AG of Maryland, will address the burning question, can we pass the For the People Act? So I hope you'll keep an eye out for that through email and our website and join us then. If you want to stay on after the call and have a little casual and informal conversation with Wendy and Gail and Anne, you can stay on after 8. We'll keep the call open so you can have a chat. Please feel free to do that. But I'd like to get going on our Spotlight speaker tonight and introduce Media Matters and Angelo. For nearly 20 years, and Media Matters has been the nation's premier media watchdog and rapid response research center, known for exposing right-wing media manipulation and its impact on news and public debates. Their current campaigns include the Ban Trump Now campaign, which will work to ensure that Trump is not allowed back on Facebook, and the Unfox My Cable Box, which is aimed at weakening Fox News even further through curtailing subscriptions. This comes on top of a very strategic approach of hitting Fox where it hurts through their ad revenue. They've had a lot of successes. I'm going to give you top 3 right now. One was stopping Sinclair's expansion, the toxifying its brand and taking down its big name hosts. They also sounded the alarm early about the rise of QAnon and adherents like Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene. And my personal favorite is helping to get Steve Bannon's horrible YouTube show deplatformed on YouTube. The list is very long. I highly recommend you check out their website too. So on to Angelo. Angelo was named President and CEO of Media Matters in December of 2016. He was the organization's vice president. He joined Media Matters in 2010, but in 2016, he took a bit of a break to serve as the deputy CEO for finance and administration for the 2016 Democratic National Convention. Angelo is an expert on right-wing extremism and has become a go-to resource for journalists writing about disinformation. He is recognized authority on brand safety and advertising, as well as a prolific organizer who has led many high-profile corporate campaigns. Notably, and we all need to thank Angelo for this, Angelo launched the viral #DumpTrump campaign in 2010 that convinced Macy's to terminate its business partnership with Donald Trump. To continue that with the Fox News theme, Angelo was also instrumental in the advertising pressure campaigns that resulted in Glenn Beck and Bill O'Reilly getting terminated from Fox News. So thank you for that, Angelo. I just want to remind everyone to please put their questions in the chat, and the equally terrific Dave Thau of Media Matters will be moderating your questions from the Q&A. So with that, I'm going to let Angelo and Dave take it away. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you. That's very nice. So what I thought I would do is try to keep most of it open for discussion, but there are three parts that I thought would be helpful to discuss. One is I just want to go through a little bit of an example of how the work that Media Matters does, one, has an effect, and two, can be a good indicator for what's around the bend. And I think that's in some ways, especially in this moment, the most critical piece and takeaway that we can provide is what's actually going to happen over the next 2 years, and how do we anticipate that, and then what does that mean for everything else, and then how do we sort of avoid the threats from it. And then the second is just to talk a little bit about what the media currently looks like right now. A lot has changed in the last year, a ton in the last 2 months, because Donald Trump's not on social media right now, and because the platforms have started to apply their rules. I can't emphasize how much that makes a difference, not just in terms of what you see online, but how that then has an effect on the rest of the media conversation. Not having a relentless stream of tweets means that there's a whole universe of reporters and segments on TV and pages in the first 5 pages of newspapers that are not being devoted to the controversy that he's stirring, which means other things are starting to fill the gap. And then the last thing is just to sort of go over some of the 2 big campaigns that we're working on now, and sort of how we sort of got to decide that those were significant enough to warrant something more than just sort of day-to-day work. So right at the beginning, I think, though it was referenced in the outset, but I guess it was right around January 2018, we started to put more resources onto this QAnon conspiracy theory, which is something that was coming up in our media monitoring. And that's, a big part of what we do every day is we live monitor what's happening. So there's somebody that's listening to about 55,000 hours of television, radio, podcasts each year live. And then we archive and analyze a little more than 1 million hours more of media. And then we also have a whole other stream of what's happening in these message board communities and some of these sort of big influential sort of right-wing online spaces. And that conspiracy theory had existed in 2017. It wasn't something brand new, but in 2018 we noticed something really troubling, and that's that there was this anti-choice organization, pretty extreme, called Operation Rescue. And Operation Rescue had been prosecuted in the past. They believed in violence as a tactic. They were involved in bombing of abortion clinics in the late 90s. They sort of saw this as a legitimate tactic. And what was relevant about it for us is when they started to align with this, at that point, just a couple random QAnon posts, it told us 2 things. One, that the QAnon movement wasn't going to go away, that it was actually only going to grow. And that 2, it was going to leverage a pretty wide and influential part of the media landscape, which is these series of sort of either anti-choice or aligned right-wing media outlets to help amplify the QAnon messaging. And that's exactly what happened. In 2018, we started to see the QAnon movement grow. We couldn't get much attention for it because it seemed so far out there. I mean, the idea that a conspiracy theory centered around not just child sex trafficking, but that the media and Democrats are colluding together because they're involved in this child sex trafficking ring, because they're interdimensional demons or vampires. Like, nobody would take it seriously. One reporter from the New York Times, Michelle Goldberg, actually wrote about it in April of 2018, but no one took it seriously. And then they started showing up at Trump rallies with those Q signs. And that wasn't an accident, actually. It was a tactic. They learned that from parts of these new groups that they had merged with. And then it got more media attention and the movement started to grow. What was really concerning about that, though, at least, and this is where sort of our work came in, is that what we realized we needed to do at that moment was not just treat this as something that was outrageous, that warranted people to sort of shake their fists at, but we actually needed the media themselves to understand 2 things. One, how this movement was gaining political power, and 2, how they themselves were actually helping amplify and grow it, because their bad coverage was actually giving this QAnon thing more attention. So every time they would write about the mysterious people at the Trump rallies with the Q signs and the Q shirts, they were helping amplify that. because they were creating the conditions where people would go and search or be curious about it. Now, most people would say that's ridiculous and move on, but they were helping elevate the profile of it without giving appropriate context for what it was. And so we couldn't get anyone interested, nothing. I mean, the reporters just thought it was too far out there to give any attention to. And so then we started to track, this is moving now into early 2019, we're getting closer to the primaries. And we started to track candidates in the primaries that were QAnon adherents. So what we were doing was looking at their social media feeds, and then this constellation of QAnon radio programs that started to pop up. And it seems insane to think about, but some of these shows were bigger than CNN. I mean, there was two prominent QAnon podcasts, but one of them was live streamed on YouTube, that had an average 1.3 million live viewers every night in 2019, every night. And like that is a pretty big thing. That's a lot of people to be paying attention to. And what we started to track, though, were these candidates that were running in primaries that were also QAnon adherents. And 5, 10, 15, 20, by early spring 2019, we had tracked at that point 30 or 40 candidates that were running the primaries that were QAnon advocates. By the time 2020 emerged, we were at 60. Now, then it started to become a political story, because by that point, at the end of 2019, the Department of Justice had labeled them a domestic terror threat. We had started to pressure some of the platforms to actually say, you have rules against this, Roku, Apple, in some cases, YouTube, you need to actually enforce your rules against this. This movement is growing at an incredibly fast pace. And some of them did, right, which lowered the ceiling, reduced the expansion. But by the beginning of 2020, and in total, there were 94 candidates that were QAnon adherents that ran in the primaries, just for the federal level. 24 of them made their way to the ballot in November. And sort of the way that the strategy there was, we sort of, one, saw it early. We were able to look at what was going to come around the bend, why it mattered. And then the way we approached it was two ways. One, try to make sure the media did not become a part of the problem, and to continue to be a part of the problem. And two, to the best extent that we can, lower the ceiling and the reach for growth. So instead of trying to chase after all their conspiracies after they spread everywhere, what can we do on the front end to at least reduce their power or their expansion? And that was a big part. We wouldn't have been able to make that assessment without the context of all the, the sort of our awareness about the landscape to begin with, and then also the ability to identify where those fulcrums were, so that they were moving into Roku and a whole bunch of other outlets. The end result of all of that is that QAnon was ultimately banned. I mean, we would argue too late, but it took a lot of work to get there. One of the things that the platforms did was say in the late summer of 2020 that we will ban just the violent QAnon groups. And they sort of took out, at that point, maybe 20% of the QAnon community. And what we had done a lot in the month of September was very dutifully go through and show that you couldn't separate out or make a distinction between QAnon and violent parts of QAnon and QAnon. And the reason I think in that context it was really mattered is that, one, all the platforms removed the QAnon community by at least their infrastructure by the beginning of October. And the way that we did that was by sort of pressuring them to obviously take action against them. If you go back and look, I don't think there was a single moment that would have had more of a determining outcome on the ability to scale and operationalize the attack on the Capitol on January 6th than the elimination of the QAnon communities and their infrastructure that took place in October. And the evidence for that is actually April of 2020. Every single one of the reopened protests that you saw around the country were not just anti-vax groups or militia groups. Every single one of those protests that were highly effective at both shifting the narrative, in some cases shutting down state capitals, shutting down local government offices, every single one of them were scaled, meaning the number of people that showed up, the sheer volume, were directly the result of local or several QAnon groups that had already existed online getting people on the streets. What QAnon had demonstrated by that point, and that's why you saw so many politicians on the right becoming QAnon adherents, is not just that they had the numbers, but they had something that a lot of other extremists don't always have online, which is the ability to go offline like that. They had shut down the Hoover Dam. They had led to multiple attacks around the country. I mean, one woman in Texas thought that, this is right before the pandemic, was convinced that a local restaurant was part of the QAnon conspiracy, drove her car through it, hit 4 people. There was a shooting in California, and a similar circumstance. They had a huge amount of capacity for offline action. And a lot of why we hear about them in the context of the Capitol is because so many of those adherents were there, but them not having that infrastructure I think made all the difference in terms of numbers. It just did. And so I start with that for 2 reasons. One is to show that you can look around the bend, and there are some trends around the bend that I think are equally relevant or significant to what we saw back in 2018 with QAnon. And then the second is that to show that you can actually take really strategic and meaningful interventions to not, I wish, eliminate the problem entirely, but if not to eliminate the problem entirely, to affect the fulcrum and the points that will have real significant impact in preventing harms or further harms. And that's sort of the way that we approached it. By that point, the QAnon bag had sort of, cat was out of the bag, and there's a lot of research around how Trump helped accelerate that very intentionally over the summer. But what we were really focused on in September and October was, how do we make sure that this infrastructure that was built, which at that point was bigger, the single biggest part of the right-wing infrastructure was all these QAnon groups. How do we make sure that they are not instrumental in operationalizing not just a misinformation campaign to undermine the election, but actually, more concerning, the offline and on the ground action? And that is sort of, so I start with that because that's, I think, the most I want to, and then obviously it ended with Marjorie Taylor Greene getting removed from her committees because we had all that research. I mean, we started to release it in January, because we had been doing all of this. We had all of her comments about space lasers and her 9/11 truth, the conspiracy theories that the Parkland students never happened. I mean, those are all things that we were tracking. She wasn't the only QAnon either elected official or public official that got in trouble because of research that we had released, but her comments were obviously among the most clear, and she had the ability to sort of garner attention in a more, I think, potent way. So that's sort of the beginning. The second thing that I just want to run through quickly, sort of to that end, is to say, okay, that's then. So what does it matter, for the future, and why does sort of our work intersect with everything? And part of the reason I'm at Media Matters and why I do this work to begin with is that it doesn't matter what the issue is. I mean, the media is going to affect the outcome. And so to me, that's the one that's it always sticks with me. How the media deals with it is going to shape and influence whatever it is, a political campaign, a policy fight. I always think back to how much money was spent on political ads last cycle, and that Democrats spent $4.6 billion on political ads, and Republicans spent $2.6 billion, and it was still pretty close. And part of the reason why such Democrats had to outspend Republicans just to sort of get close to parity is because the right has a huge advantage online. There was not a single day in 2020 where the right wing did not control the entire conversation. And by control, I mean, if it was a pie chart, 50 to 60% of all of the information consumed every single day was coming explicitly from a right-wing source. And then the rest of it is divvied up between news and or non-aligned outlets and sort of left-leaning infrastructure. That's incredible. That means that not only does the media have an effect on the outcome, but that so much of what people see and hear is shaped by an engine of not just extremism, but that also peddles in misinformation and disinformation. And that's how you can get this big lie to saturate so quickly and so fast, is that they will always start with a head start. And so some of the asymmetry in the ad spending is needed to kind of balance things out, but ultimately they have that huge advantage. So the quick things that I would just run through is that talk radio is obviously still, people forget that a lot of people listen to it. I mean, Sean Hannity has 15 million listeners on talk radio, but I pulled the thread on that to remind everyone that YouTube is basically talk radio for young men, that the right basically dominates YouTube, I'm sorry, Lindy, what was the percent? What was the percentage of what of share of voice? The right share of voice is on every day is 50 to 60%. So if you look at all the information consumed, it is coming from right-leaning sources. 50 to 60% is the average. There are many days where it hits 70%. There were peak points of the summer in August and September where the share of voice for the right were over 70% every day, which is just an incredible imbalance. So all that's to say, every day we start with a disadvantage, and that makes a huge. That's something that always has to be conquered and overcome. I referenced number one. I want everyone to remember about YouTube, and that is basically the equivalent of talk radio in the 90s, and that a lot of young men in particular are consuming a lot of pretty extreme content through YouTube, and also disinformation and misinformation. They go together. I think that there's this assumption that the future will save us and that younger people will not become radicalized. That is an assumption that is not true. That actually yes, the trend lines are good, but part of the same way that the information landscape sort of shifted how the media covered climate change in the 90s and early 2000s by constantly working the refs and pumping it full of misinformation is the same trend that we're seeing now in the parts of the information landscape that target young people in particular under the age of 25. So that's the first thing that I would just throw out there. The second big assessment that I would just flag around the bend is that, while much of the QAnon and the extremists have sort of been smashed up, one of the things they've done is sort of retreat to private circles, or these closed groups. And these closed groups can have 5,000 or 6,000 members, but the way that a right-wing blog or parts of these like 4chan, these message board communities were influential a few years ago, today and in the future, the big place where much of the misinformation is going to start and originate and incubate is going to start in these peer-to-peer groups, these private groups that have 100 or 200 people on them. And the reason that matters in this context is not just that it's organic. One of the things that we saw pretty consistently is very sophisticated information operations, whether they're foreign or not, of people going into these private groups and seeding the ground with disinformation. And so if you can become, and so that means they're uniquely vulnerable, they're harder to track and assess. So one example of this is before January 6th, we had this big media infiltration operation. We're in about 1,600 of these big private communities. There's a network of pro-gun ones, so most of the conversation is about guns and gun rights. In the days leading up to January 6th, all of a sudden we started seeing the same content being posted in these pro-gun private groups, which that when you go to the Capitol, bring your gun. And the reason that was relevant was that that's always the opposite. DC has such strict gun laws that all the gun groups, even the really far right ones, whenever they're doing a demonstration, actually send the opposite reminder. They always tell their members, remember, the gun laws, you can't, there's no open carry, there's no, like, you cannot bring your guns, don't bring your guns into the district. Like, that is a condition that they socialize. And yet right before the January 6th, we started seeing a consistency in all these private communities telling people, forget it, this time you bring your gun. And that wasn't an accident. It wasn't organic. It was a clear disinformation campaign. We tracked it, we saw it, we flagged it for Facebook 2 days in advance. They didn't deem it to be a threat worth investigating any further. It was obvious that some of the accounts that were posting those messages were actually the same individuals or being operated by the same individuals because of the message itself was nearly identical. But that's what we see is within these communities, a unique vulnerability. So that's the second thing, is that we have to be really concerned about what these private communities are going to do, because they're harder to track, harder to monitor, but extraordinarily influential. And then the last thing that I would just mention, and that's sort of segue into the solution side, and then we can have a discussion, is Fox is under fire a lot. And there was this idea in November, because of the attacks that they were getting, that sort of they're down and out, and they are in a bad place. They are sort of trapped between a rock and a hard place. Their audience is mad at them. They can't give them everything that they want because their entire business model will completely collapse if they do. But on the other hand, they can't be responsible because they will lose any shred of relation with their audience that they have. And then they have these burgeoning networks, One America News and Newsmax, that are out there that are getting increased ratings and more viewers. And there is a moment right now where, if you think about Fox, one of the things that they were able to do so effectively back in 2009 and 2010 was establish themselves as the voice of the opposition. And what that meant is that they could drive narratives, not just amongst their people and their viewers, but actually shift coverage at other outlets by attacking and shaming them for not talking about enough. So in this moment, there's some vulnerability with Fox. And I think that I would just throw that on the table that it's a small window. They are sort of trapped between and wedged into a weird spot right now. Newsmax and One American News will be with us for the long haul. They're not going anywhere. The one thing that can happen, and this will segue into the solutions, or some two big solutions, would be, right now, One American News only has one cable provider, and that is AT&T. And they are beginning right at the end of this month. That contract expires. What they're hoping to do is get put on. They get the same deal that Fox has and Newsmax has, is to be on everybody's basic cable package. That's not just going to give them a bunch of money, but it will also give them access, which means they can then more easily compete with Fox News. If you wanted to watch One American News, which I don't suggest you do, it's hard. It's really hard to do it. It's a pain. Like if you had a homework assignment to go do that, you would be like, this is aggravating. It's 30 minutes in, I still can't figure out what to download. I need like 3 programs and I have to hook it to my TV. Like, it's not easy to watch One American News right now. That's a good thing. Like, it's fine that they exist. I wish they didn't, but it's not good that you cannot watch One American News very easily. It is good that you cannot watch One American News very easily. It's a good thing. That may not be the case in 6 months. It may be in everybody's basic cable package. And so there's this moment right now in terms of organizing where we can prevent them to scale. And that's a heavy focus of what we're doing, is to make sure that they don't get the kind of pickup and carriage that if they were to get, would make them much more accessible. So briefly, I'm just going to run through 2 solutions that I think are really significant right now. They're relevant to seeing around the bend, but they're also relevant to the threat, and then we can talk. So the first one is banning Trump from Facebook. All the social media companies eliminated Trump's Facebook account because of constant rule violations, except for Facebook. They only made it temporary, and they were very clever about how they did it. When they made the announcement in January, it seemed like they were first, but in fact, their language was always clear that it was temporary. The reason it matters, I'm a very petty person, and so I would like to say it's all about Trump, and that would be fine, but I'm not sure I can make a very strong strategic argument if it was all about Trump. The truth is, it's about something much bigger than that. When Trump was removed from his social media accounts, election misinformation on the internet fell by 73%. 73%. It was measurable. You could measure the actual effect that he was having on it, because think about it. He says something. It's not just that it reaches a bunch of people, but then they're talking about that topic. They're amplifying him. They're screenshotting his tweets. They're screenshotting his Facebook posts. And then the other effect that I think is more invisible, which is that when you have the single biggest platform on the internet and you
Harvey,
do something,
how do I get back on?
you affect the algorithm. You affect the algorithm. You affect the algorithm. And that's what was happening every day, is that when Trump would do things especially on Facebook, the entire algorithm would be distorted around that content, around that topic and content. So when he would post something, not just would his direct content about it get a boost, all the One American News segments would, the Newsmax segments would, the Gateway pundits, the far right content. And one example of that is a QAnon. When Trump started to actively promote QAnon in May of 2020, the growth rates for QAnon on Facebook shot up, and their growth rates, the average growth rate for QAnon groups and pages during this time was 24%. And for example, the average growth rate for a news page on Facebook is 0.7%. The average growth rate for a left-leaning page is 1%. The average growth rate for a right-leaning page, which prior to May 22 was like considered mind-blowingly huge, was 2.2%. 2.2, and that was considered like above the bell curve. When right-leaning pages were having 2% growth rates in early 2020, most people who do this work were apoplectic at what that meant for the growth rates. When Trump started to promote QAnon content, those communities had 24% growth rates, and 70% of growth on Facebook comes from Facebook's own algorithm recommending new people to join. So it is a big deal that Trump's gone, not just because it has a direct effect on reducing the misinformation. That one number of 73% is one example. There have been other studies out there, but it also has a huge effect on the algorithm and on what other extremist communities are able to organize and benefit from that. So the way to ban them is now there's a window where there's some pressure. In all the other platforms, the thing that made them switch from being a temporary ban and suspension to permanent was when their employees revolted. It took the internal staff saying, we're not going to be enablers of an attack on the Capitol. This can't be business as usual, to shift the conversation internally and actually force them to flip the switch from temporary to public. The only ones that haven't done that is Facebook. They haven't done it. So there's some work to be done directly to pressure Facebook's employees so that they feel and bring more of that to these internal staff meetings. And that is the bellwether, because ultimately employees are talent. And especially in the tech space, you need that talent. It's highly competitive. And if you feel like you're going to lose them, you're going to take steps to inoculate against it. And so one is a campaign and pressure to make sure that Facebook does not makes this Trump ban permanent. The decision day will be around May 8th or 9th. That's the window. We're all going to know very soon. But I think, if he comes back, all of those other conditions change. And it's not just the online space. That means that you then have the rest of the effect on the traditional media as well, as they start to respond to and talk about Trump's tweets. And you started to see it a little bit this week. They couldn't resist. There was an itch. He said one comment about Meghan Markle. It's gotten 7 CNN segments today alone. And there was a shooting last night and a lot of other stuff going on. And it's already gotten 7 CNN segments that Trump commented on Meghan Markle. It's like, okay, if he has a Facebook account or the ability to do that, that's what you'll start to see all the time. So it is a big effect, because if we deal with it on the front end, at least we don't have to be then fighting all the repercussions that happen if it gets that center of gravity back. And then the other big one is an initiative focused on Fox. And actually, I went from being in somewhat sour mood before 7 o'clock to right before we started becoming in a great mood, because a big thing that we've been working on related to this campaign around on Fox My Cable Box actually just came through. So the gist of the campaign is, Fox cheats. It's not just that they lie, they also cheat. They don't need any advertisers. They could have 0 commercials and still have a 90% profit margin. They're the second most expensive channel on everybody's cable box, although I'm very proud to say that their cable fees are actually decreasing because they had a rough last 2 negotiations. And so a big part of what we're trying to do is to say to these cable companies, and that's the way where most of their revenue comes from. They get money from every cable company pays every cable channel a small fee, 3, 4, 15 cents, 20 cents for every customer that they have. It's not meant to be the primary way that commercial media companies make money. It's a carriage fee. It's what you pay to make sure that you can include that channel and distribute it to your customers. Fox games the system. They've engaged in really aggressive tactics. They've engaged in very aggressive negotiations over the last few years, like 20 years, to make sure that they are the second or third most expensive channel on everybody's cable box. So that means that even if people never watch Fox News or turn it on, they're paying a lot of money for it. Premium prices. They are 5 to 7 times more expensive than MSNBC. They're twice what you get, what CNN gets. And with CNN, you get 3 channels. With Fox, you just get Fox. If they had to compete, and cable fees have nothing to do with ratings. Because Fox Business doesn't have a lot of viewers, and yet they're like the 10th most expensive channel on everybody's cable box. It's these negotiations. And in the past, they had The Simpsons and entertainment. Now they don't have that anymore because they sold it to Disney. So they have the NFL. Everybody loves football. A lot of people do. I don't watch it, but I watch college football a little bit with my husband, but not pro. But apparently, a lot of people do. And Fox uses the NFL during these negotiations. What they do when they're having a negotiation with the cable company is they say, we want you to pay $3 for Fox News. The cable company says that's ridiculous. And they say, okay, we just turn it off. They literally just turn it off. They did that to Hulu last year, 2 days before the Super Bowl. They asked Hulu for a 80% increase in fees. Hulu said no, they turned it off. No Super Bowl for Hulu viewers. That's how they leverage their relationship with the NFL. And so a part of this campaign is to organize people so that they can then start pressuring their cable companies. And there's a whole arc around that. But then the second piece is, what can we do to reduce Fox's leverage? And this isn't public yet, but it will be in the next day or so, is, we had been working with the NAACP to get them to ask the NFL a basic question. Right now, the NFL is actually renegotiating with Fox News, with Fox for their new license for Fox Sports. So it was a simple question, which was just ask the NFL to make sure that Rupert Murdoch cannot use the NFL to help fund Tucker Carlson. Just it's a simple thing. And if just put in, if you want to use a brand, you should pay for it, right? But they've been using the NFL and the NFL doesn't get anything out of this. And so there were several meetings and negotiations with the NAACP and the NFL last week, and some back and forth pressure, which was they were shocked, I think, a little bit by what they heard. There'll be some press coverage around the outcome of that over the next day. That's why I was happy, because it's hard to get reporters to write about this, partly because of their the weird space that it's all in. It doesn't fit neatly in one beat, and partly because it's complicated, and no one talks about this part of the way the media works. And so to get them up to speed on it, and then to start to dig in, it seems, I think it's always been a little bit of a struggle, though we're getting there. Nick Kristof endorsed our campaign a couple of weeks ago, but ultimately, it matters, because what you will see in the next couple of months is that the Murdochs won't be able to leverage the NFL the same way they had been during these negotiations. And if you weaken that position, it means that when these other negotiations start up with cable companies, they won't be able to turn around and turn off Fox Sports anymore. And that's going to be, it means it's going to be a lot harder for them to increase everybody's cable bills, to get more money for content right now that doesn't have any advertisers. So those are our two big things. I know I've sort of talked a lot, but I sort of wanted they're illustrations, I think, of how when we look at the problem, part of it is just we're managing it day to day with trench warfare, but there are a few big things that really can make a measurable difference. And we try to zero in on those when we can, and make that difference, then move on to the next one. So I'll sort of wrap up there, and then we can kind of just talk.
Angelo, breaking news under the tent. I love it. All right, I'm gonna throw you a couple of questions, Angelo, along the lines of Unfox My Cable Box. Another issue that Fox is dealing with, obviously, as is OAN and others, is the Dominion voting machine lawsuits. What's the status of those, and what do you think the outcome or impact might be?
I think that we helped do a lot of the research for that, and the one thing that I think they will matter the most on is discovery. They're absolutely going to survive discovery, which means that the plaintiff's attorneys are going to be able to get documents, internal emails, internal communications at Fox News. And the reason that really makes a difference is that Fox's bubble has not been pierced many times, but there have been two notable instances. One where we got a bunch of leaked memos that showed their news people forcibly telling people to lie about the temperature record. And that was explosive for them, because it basically proved that they knew climate change was real, but were lying about it. And the second one was during the phone hacking scandal, when there was this massive investigation. And the second you started to get some of that information, it just unraveled. And all of a sudden you realize that the Murdochs have been hacking thousands of people's telephones in the UK. I think we're at a similar moment, where if you can just see what those communications are, what you will find out is that they were lying on purpose, that they knew it wasn't true, but they were saying it anyway for political reasons. And that's where I think, regardless of what the outcome is, or these things, sort of have a Dickens-esque effect to them, where they could last for decades. And I sort of know that, but the one thing that won't last for decades is discovery. Once the discovery phase is sort of underway, we're going to see a little bit behind the curtain as to how they knowingly lied. And that will be real and tangible, in the near future. And I think of all the things, the money side of it and the appeals will last a long time, but that one piece alone, it will happen. It will be real, and I think it will be a real game changer. Because when you see them intentionally lying, it changes things. It rattles shareholders. It really shifts their obligations, and I think that to me is the biggest takeaway. The second is, I think you're going to see more litigation. I think you're going to see litigation around the coronavirus misinformation as well. I'm not going to break that news yet, but I would just say I think you will see that as well.
Speaking of COVID misinformation, Gail Kosla, who's watching this pretty closely and could probably be a monitor at Media Matters, said that Miles Bach and Steve Bannon seem to have joined forces to spread disinformation around COVID and other topics. What's their goal? Is this tied to China in any way?
It's tied to a Chinese billionaire who's an anti-communist. His name is Mao Guo, and he funds Chinese Communist Party content. He funds a lot of like publications, some of the disinformation campaigns, especially targeting the Latino communities. Back in 2020, we had tracked back to him, so that is Steve Bannon's benefactor right now, and he basically calls the shots, and Bannon just runs the play. Just to give one example, I'm very proud of this. We have one staff member who just focuses on Steve Bannon and other stuff, but she does Steve Bannon. She's so deeply inside Steve Bannon's head that he, when a guest is performing poorly on his show, he scolds them and her name is Madeline Peltz. She scolds them and says, Madeline is going to tweet mean things about you now and make us look bad. She's going to think we're dumb. And it is incredible. And he even apologizes to her on air now. He says, Matt, I didn't know he was going to say that. He just got My Pillow as a sponsor, and his sponsor code is Madeline. Which that is how much like our staff member is inside Steve Bannon's head. So yeah, there is an alignment there, and a lot of that has to do with the money though, and it is all coming from Miles Guo, and it's an enormous amount of resources and infrastructure. It's not just Bannon, it's a series of publications and a few sort of under the radar disinformation operations.
Madeline's an absolute rock star, is actually the one who uncovered a lot of these tapes of Tucker Carlson saying awful, racist, bigoted things. And I just put a great Washington Post piece on her in the chat if anybody wants to read it. A couple of questions about voids, either current or upcoming in the right-wing media. Obviously, the passing of Rush Limbaugh. Is there anybody who will fill that void on talk radio? And then also about Rupert Murdoch. When he moves on, will Lachlan take over? Does he have any interest? I know you have some thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'll start with the Rupert Murdoch Lachlan one. Lachlan scares me more than anything. He's scary, and he just is. The Rupert Murdoch. I obviously am a critic, but he's an institutionalist, and he's a business person, but he's an institutionalist, and he wants the institution that he built to survive and to be durable. Lachlan Murdoch does not want that. And the other thing is he's deeply aligned with Tucker Carlson. They are very close, and Tucker Carlson isn't really close to anybody. And that's there's an ideological alignment there that is different. But I think what concerns me a lot about the Lachlan piece is that there was at least some assumptions you can make about where the line would be drawn with Rupert Murdoch and sort of how he would then navigate around it. We have none of those assumptions with Lachlan. And I always sort of think of him as like kind of a comet or a meteor heading at us and just getting ready to burn up. And I worry that, Fox could get a lot worse, if they're entirely unconstrained without any accountability. He's totally immune to pressure too. That's the other piece. It doesn't faze him at all. We did a big power mapping of a bunch of the decision makers before the Sky News takeover in the UK. And at that point, James Murdoch was the CEO. And it was just a different context, looking at the way that he thought about his obligations as CEO compared to, the considerations of that Lachlan brought to the table. Even Roger Ailes, I'll just say to his credit, was a more responsible steward than Lachlan Murdoch is. And that, I think, says everything you need to know about that. It's a real threat. On the Rush Limbaugh
Angelo,
piece, yeah.
Just really quick before going on to Rush, Jill just asked about James. Do you want to just explain the context there?
Yeah, there's two brothers. James Murdoch is the youngest brother, and he was the CEO of 21st Century Fox when, I guess back in 2016, 2017. And he left the company. He's actually become a little bit of a critic of some parts of it now. He's a business person. I think he probably leans a little bit left, but ultimately he's a business person. So he was, he had a long-term vision for the company where you could see how Fox was a problem for that vision. It actually probably would have ended up being more profitable, to be honest, if they had to go with him, because his plan was focused around sports rights around soccer and a bigger global reach. It would have been more money. Realistically, it would have been more money. It just would have been a pain to get there. It would have taken them a while, but he was very much involved in the Sky News takeover, which didn't happen, and he left the company, and Lachlan Murdoch ultimately was sort of put in charge. But yeah, there are two brothers. There's just a little bit of a tension. There's a lot of family drama, I think, in the Murdochs as a whole. But he's a business person, and in a way that Lachlan Murdoch is not. And Lachlan Murdoch genuinely concerns me more than anyone, because he's totally immune to pressure. He really is. He needs to be forced. And then on Rush Limbaugh, there won't be a replacement for Rush Limbaugh, at least in terms of platform. In fact, that 12 to 3 p.m. hour is being carved up right now. So there will be new people. Some of them are YouTube stars. Dan Bongino, who got his start at the NRA and now has a prominent YouTube show, and Ben Shapiro are the two biggest benefactors so far. They've each gotten about 50 to 60 new stations. Rush Limbaugh had a total of 600 in his footprint. There'll probably be 3 or 4 more that will get some version of 50 or 60 stations, and that's kind of how they'll carve it up. And then some of those stations will get rid of right-wing talk and just shift over to either back to local, or they'll change formats. They'll move to country music, to be honest. Without Rush Limbaugh, they won't be able to survive. I think somewhere between 70 and 80 of the stations that Limbaugh will switch from being conservative talk stations to country stations within the next year, solely because without Limbaugh, they don't have a station anymore. And so, but Dan Bongino and Ben Shapiro are the two biggest benefactors so far. For context, Dan Bongino is the person that owns Parler, outside of the Mercers, but Dan Bongino is the sort of the founder, or one of the co-founders of Parler. And Ben Shapiro runs Daily Wire, which is one of a really sort of influential show, website network online. But a last piece on that. So even though that there won't be a replacement for Limbaugh in terms of structure, for decades, Limbaugh was like the titular head of the Republican Party or conservatives. He was sort of the biggest voice and the ideological driver. That person has been replaced by Tucker Carlson. Everything is now a carbon copy of Tucker Carlson's comment. He is really the intellectual driving force of the right, which means things are going to get a lot more racist and white supremacist, and much more explicitly violent than they had been. Limbaugh's big shift right before he passed was to endorse violence in a more explicit way. Tucker Carlson's already there.
There's a great segment on John Oliver from this past Sunday on Tucker Carlson that's terrifying, that Media Matters provided the majority of the research on. You mentioned Parler, so we'll go to Anne's question. Are these peer-to-peer misinformation groups all small Facebook groups and YouTube groups? So maybe it's worth talking about WhatsApp a little bit. Is Parler going to become a player again? And do these QAnon members actually believe the information about Democrats being pedophiles and space aliens starting forest fires?
Ooh, so Parler will never become a thing again. It will exist for a while, and it will constantly just burn money, a lot of it, but it will never be a thing again. For a lot of reasons. It doesn't have an app, so you have to go to the website. So it's not fun. It's not fun. You want an app, especially for something like that. Like most people do it on their phones. It's awful. And if you have an app, you have it downloaded, you can keep using it, which means, but like these people can never replace their phones. Like they're done. It's never going to go anywhere. It's going to be this thing that exists, and people will copy their tweets and other content into Parler as like a secondary thing, but it'll never be a thing again. And I am fine with them burning $30-40 million, every 6 months to keep that thing alive, because it's just like less other nonsense of like new, possibly damaging stuff that we'd have to deal with. But it'll never be a thing. Gab will be a thing. Gab should scare everybody. Gab has their own infrastructure. Like one of the things that makes Media Matters, and I knew that this, I complain about this a lot to reporters, but like Parler used cloud services. They were susceptible. Gab doesn't have cloud services. Gab has servers and infrastructure, and Gab is run by like an open Nazi. He like started the platform so Nazis could not be deplatformed. His name is Andrew Torba. And they are growing at a fast rate. Now they just had a little bit of a data breach, but I think people will gloss over that and not believe it. But they will be the Parler of 2022 in the future. And they are immune to any pressure. They don't need advertisers. You cannot deplatform them. Amazon can kick them off. It makes no difference. They have their own infrastructure. So Gab is going to be the future in terms of just like where these communities are. A lot of them are on Gab. Then there's Telegram, which is like another messaging tool, mostly private Facebook groups. And then the last one is WhatsApp, which is like another messaging tool. WhatsApp is bigger than every other social media platform in the United States except for TikTok and Facebook. So WhatsApp currently has 100 million users in the United States. Twitter only has like 65 million users. So like it is, and WhatsApp is, can be used for, but a lot of it is local organizing. All of the reopen stuff, a lot of the things that we saw in the early days of the pandemic, most of the misinformation in the first 2 weeks of the pandemic, the FBI is sending tanks down the street, all that stuff, all WhatsApp. So everything you saw on Facebook and elsewhere, it already had circulated on WhatsApp well beforehand. That was driving a lot of the new disinformation. So those are the places where these sort of like the organizing happens. A lot of it is private Facebook groups and WhatsApp. WhatsApp is owned by Facebook, and they can do things that will make a difference. It's tougher to get them to act on that, but there are some things that they can do that will have a serious effect on reducing the pressure in the landscape. But they're just those are going to be the communities of the future. I wouldn't worry about Parler anymore. I think Gab is the thing to be scared of. That's right, Belinda. Instagram is owned by Facebook too.
I'm going to try to sneak in two more. I'm going to combine a few questions. How can we make structural changes to change this right-wing hold on social media and mainstream media and overcome that 70% number that you mentioned earlier? And is the Biden administration working on this at all? And then coupled with that, do you think that Garland, now as the AG, is going to be doing anything in terms of, flexing the muscle of justice to be able to impact any of these issues?
So the first one, I'm always a naysayer and a doomsayer, which I realize because obviously, but I'm not. That's not my. I'm not. It's not that it's not ever winnable, but I actually have a positive one on this one. So you're already doing it. Actually, it's already happening, shifting that 73% number. And here's the data point for that. Back in the 2016 election, if you looked at the online landscape, 1 out of every 2 people that identified as left of center, almost it's 47%. So just about 1 out of every 2 did not post content related to politics or civic engagement on their social media feeds because they did not want to be trolled, harassed, or abused. Not because they didn't care, because they didn't want to deal with all the BS around it. They just didn't think it mattered. That number was only 8% of the conservative side. So only 8% of people that identified as right didn't post content related to politics. The reason why I say it's already happening is groups like this, others, all of this interconnectivity actually did have a measurable effect on starting to recognize that people need to be engaged more and to talking more about these things. So while that 73% number is awful and terrible, if you look at the full trend line, it's actually gone down. It's very slow, and they'll cheat. And that's why I think it requires constant effort. It's clearly a very, very big gap that we can't allow to happen. But their share of voice is actually, they've gotten weaker since 2016. And it's actually because there has been an outgrowth of people engaging and building small clusters of peer-to-peer networks and starting to reprime the pump of communication. And that in a short period of time is actually quite a lot. What they had was a 20-year investment in building these networks of disinformation. It wasn't just something that they turnkey. And so one, I'd say it's more of this. 2, there is a lot of cheating that still happens. And a lot of it is at the platform level. There are things on the edges that make a difference, but ultimately they let people cheat. We went through 6,000 of Donald Trump's, all of his 2020 posts. We found 24% of them violated Facebook's rules. 24%, which means that at any moment they could have removed him, punished him, sanctioned him, reduced his reach. They didn't. 24%. So a part of the biggest thing that can be done, aside from things like this, are actually when we zero in on some of these big pivot points in cheating to stop them from happening. So a little bit of a bright spot, because I actually think these kinds of groups really do make a difference. They measurably have an effect in total. But if you want to accelerate that timeline, a lot of it is going to be on some of these big pivot points.
So we're at the top of the hour. I'm going to squeeze in one more question, though, and this is something that a lot of people ask, and it's one of the things I love about this group. The question asked over and over here is, what can we do to help?
I love it. So I think what we'll do is send an email in the follow-up, and then we've done a volunteer operation before, and people can volunteer if they want to do stuff. There's always stuff to do. We always do cool projects that we kind of have on the side that we put resources into. Right now we're doing a project for like Steven Crowder, who just got his stuff removed from YouTube yesterday. He's basically going to be Rush Limbaugh in 10 years. Like in terms of his size, he'll have 5 to 10 million listeners easily. He'll be one of the loudest voices in the room. We can stop him now. Most of what he does breaks the rules every day. That's the problem. If I went to YouTube and said most of the stuff that these people say, they would kick me off, right? So the part of it is a double standard. Like, we know this. They actually are afraid to enforce the terms of service against conservatives because they don't want to be viewed as anti-conservative, which is the exact reason they lie about climate change or privilege both sides. USA Today, up until recently, and they still kind of do, has a rule that if you write an op-ed about climate change, you have to have a climate skeptic op-ed next to it. So, and that's to inoculate themselves against criticism. And so it's the same thing with the platforms. They work the refs. So I think how people can help is we have a few of these like longer form research projects that are basically just people dive in, spend 2 or 3 hours listening to stuff. It's maddening, but it can be motivating for some people if you like to get mad and then punish bad people. Yeah, I think when we follow up, I can send the email address for that, and our volunteer person can help kind of carve up some of it. It's fun.
Well, Angelo, I'm going to speak on behalf of Big Tent and just say, okay, my heart is racing. My palms are sweaty. I am a little bit panicked right now, but I want to just say, you've given us so much to chew on, and we're so grateful for your time and for your time too, Dave. I'm going to end on a positive note, which is that Sarah Finney Robinson thinks that you should have a talk show, a radio show. And
Yeah.
You know what? I'm going to go with that. I think that's the way to go. But I want you to know that Big Tent is here to volunteer for you. People were like throwing their resumes up online. So we're going to be here for you, and please send that along. We've put the donation link in the chat. We've put the website in the chat for Media Matters, but you've really, you've dug in, you've done some very important work on behalf of our country. So on behalf of Big Tent and our democracy, I just want to say thank you so much, and thank everyone for attending. And if you want to stay on and chat with Wendy and Ann and Gail, please do so. But other than that, everyone stay well, and thanks again. Media Matters.
Thank you.